Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight we follow Miss Marple into the disappearance at the cricket pavilion. A player vanishes, the pavilion whispers with secrets, and the question remains, who stands to gain from silence? Are you listening late at night or with your morning tea? Subscribe for more mysteries. Now light a candle, sit back and let the mystery begin. The summer afternoon lay like a silk shawl across the village green, its warmth punctuated by the occasional clapping of gloved hands, the cries of encouragement from the fielders, and the comfortable murmur of voices drifting from the spectators gathered under parasols. The St. Mary Mead Cricket Club was facing its annual rivals from Much Benham, and the match was, to the villagers, nearly as important as Christmas or the Harvest Festival. Near the boundary, Mrs. Bantry fanned herself with a folded programme, while Colonel Melchett offered commentary on the bowling with the authority of a man who had once played the game, albeit 30 years ago. Children ran about with lemonade bottles, while ladies in summer dresses leaned together, sharing quiet gossip behind lace handkerchiefs. The pavilion, with its white-painted timbers and polished brass bell, stood proudly at the edge of the field, its open veranda lined with eager players waiting their turn. Miss Marple, in a pale blue dress with a modest straw hat tied beneath her chin, sat placidly in her deck chair, her knitting needles clicking as smoothly as if she were alone in her cottage parlour. To the casual eye, she was absorbed in the complicated pattern of her sock, yet in truth she was listening with quiet interest to every conversation within earshot. Few noticed her. Fewer still considered that she might understand more than she let on. The match proceeded merrily until the moment when the bell signalled the tea interval. Players and spectators alike made their way toward the pavilion, for sandwiches and sponge cakes awaited on long trestle tables. The mood was jubilant, but it faltered suddenly when a curious pause fell over the veranda. The batsmen who had returned went in search of their teammate Gerald Linton, the young solicitor who had just been dismissed before the break, but he was nowhere to be found. At first it was taken as a joke. "Gone to sulk, I dare say," muttered one of the older players with a chuckle. Yet minutes passed and Gerald did not reappear. His bat remained leaning against the bench, his jacket neatly folded, but the man himself had vanished as if swallowed by the afternoon haze. The laughter that had met the first announcement soon dwindled into murmurs, then uneasy silence. A disappearance during tea was as unnatural as rain in midsummer. The search began casually, with players peering around the back of the pavilion or under the shade of the oak trees. But when no trace of Gerald was found, worry sharpened the air. Whispers of an accident and perhaps he's fainted spread quickly among the ladies, while the men strode about calling his name, their voices growing more urgent. Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and folded her hands. To those nearby she looked no more than a kindly old lady, concerned for the welfare of a young man. Yet behind her gentle eyes she was already considering. A young man does not simply vanish in the heart of a village, not in broad daylight, not with so many pairs of eyes upon the green. People, Miss Marple knew, may vanish in London crowds, but in St. Mary Mead, such disappearances spoke not of accidents but of secrets. By the time the tea urn steamed upon the table, it was evident to all that Gerald Linton had disappeared. The cricket match was forgotten. Conversation hushed to anxious tones, and more than one villager cast furtive glances about, as if the green itself concealed the truth. Miss Marple adjusted her straw hat, listening quietly, for she was quite certain that this was not merely a young man slipping away for a sulk. Something far more serious had occurred at the cricket pavilion that afternoon. The atmosphere on the cricket green shifted as subtly as a cloud crossing the sun. What had moments ago been cheerful chatter and the rustle of parasols turned into uneasy murmurs and darting glances. The sandwiches remained untouched, the sponge cakes only admired but not consumed. Instead, the disappearance of Gerald Linton became the only subject of conversation, passed from one villager to another like a parcel at a children's game. Each telling grew more dramatic, each theory more elaborate. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had never been known to overlook an opportunity for scandal, was quick to declare that young Linton had likely run off to London with some unsuitable woman. "These young men are always full of ambition and not a scrap of loyalty," she pronounced to anyone within earshot. "Mark my words, he has gone chasing some hussy, and the cricket match was nothing but an excuse." That she spoke with such certainty only made others more doubtful. Mrs. Bantry, fanning herself with agitation now, rather than because of the heat, countered with indignation. "Nonsense, Price Ridley. Gerald is a respectable solicitor with excellent practice. He was at the vicarage only last week, helping poor Mrs. Calthorpe with her late husband's papers. Hardly the behavior of a man planning a scandalous flight." Her voice trembled slightly, for the thought of a disappearance here in peaceful St. Mary Mead unsettled her greatly. Colonel Melchett, standing rather stiffly by the pavilion steps, declared with soldierly bluntness that Linton had likely slipped off into the countryside for a quiet smoke. "Mark my words, he'll come back sheepish, having hidden himself from all the fuss," he told Dr. Haydock, who was less convinced. The doctor, a tall and wiry man with sharp eyes, muttered that fainting spells and sudden vanishings rarely happened without a cause. His medical instincts suggested something more troubling than a youthful sulk. Meanwhile, younger voices joined the fray. Peggy Sims, the innkeeper's daughter, whispered to her friend that she had seen Gerald speaking to a stranger near the hedgerow earlier that morning. Tall, with a dark coat, though it was far too hot for it, she insisted. Her friend gasped, delighted by the romance of such a suggestion, and within minutes, half the ladies present were convinced that some mysterious outsider had lured Gerald away. Miss Marple remained in her chair, her hands folded over her knitting, which lay forgotten on her lap. To the casual observer, she was merely resting, a frail old woman tired by the commotion, but she was listening. Oh, she was always listening. Theories, she knew, were more revealing about the tellers than about the missing man. Mrs. Price Ridley's love of scandal suggested her own restless dissatisfaction. Colonel Melchett's insistence on practicality showed a soldier's habit of dismissing the unusual. And the girl's tale of the dark-coated stranger revealed a taste for drama and imagination. Truth, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely so eagerly embroidered. The constable from Much Benham, summoned hastily, arrived puffing and red-faced. He began the perfunctory task of asking where Gerald had last been seen. "Right after batting, sir," one of the players explained. "He left his bat here and went into the pavilion. He never came out again." The constable scratched his head and went in to search, only to re-emerge, shaking it ruefully. Not a sign of him. The back doors bolted from within, and the windows are too small for a man to squeeze through. This detail set the whispers racing again. A locked pavilion and no Gerald within it sounded like something out of the Penny Dreadfuls. Mrs. Bantry crossed herself involuntarily. "But that's impossible," she whispered. "He must be somewhere." Yet the constable's baffled expression suggested otherwise. As dusk began to creep across the village green, the cricket match was abandoned entirely, and the villagers moved in clusters, their voices low but insistent. Motives were suggested with increasing boldness. "He was carrying money," one man remarked. "Perhaps thieves." Another claimed Gerald had enemies in the city, though no one could name them. And when Mrs. Godfrey recalled that Gerald had once argued fiercely over a boundary dispute, she cast a suspicious glance at his opponent in that quarrel, who flushed angrily. Miss Marple rose at last, her slight figure almost lost among the taller villagers. She moved quietly among them, asking no questions yet receiving plenty of answers. People were inclined to talk to her, for she had a way of seeming harmless, almost forgettable. A kindly face and an inquiring nod were often enough to loosen tongues. By the time she had returned to her chair, she had gathered a wealth of little details, most of them contradictory, but all of them telling in their own fashion. What she did not say was that the locked pavilion troubled her deeply, for Miss Marple had once read of a case had known of one where a locked door concealed a grim truth. A man had vanished then too, though not for long. She kept that recollection to herself, for to speak it aloud would be to frighten the good people of St. Mary Mead. Still the memory lingered, unsettling her in a way that her companion's wild theories did not. By evening, lanterns were lit around the green, and the vicar himself urged calm, though his voice shook. "We must not leap to dark conclusions," he said, hands clasped together. "Gerald may yet return, safe and well." Yet the tremor in his tone betrayed his own doubt. The villagers dispersed reluctantly, leaving the constable to keep watch and the crickets to chirp in the cooling grass. Few slept easily that night, for the idea of a disappearance in their midst was like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples touched everyone. In her quiet cottage, Miss Marple set her knitting back into its basket. She sat in her chair by the window, gazing out at the starlit village, her mind sifting through the day's events. Gossip, she thought, was much like chaff in the wind, easily scattered, but among it one might find a kernel of truth. Tomorrow, no doubt, there would be more to hear, more to observe, and Miss Marple, with her keen eyes and sharper mind, intended to be listening. The following morning dawned crisp and deceptively peaceful, as though the village green had not only the day before played host to a most perplexing event. The sun rose with its usual brightness, the hedgerows bustled with sparrows, and the milkman clattered along his familiar route. Yet for the villagers of St. Mary Mead, the ordinary rhythm of life had been unsettled. Conversation at every doorstep, over every back fence, and across every counter in the shops turned not to baking or gardening, but to Gerald Linton and his inexplicable disappearance from the cricket pavilion. At the Blue Boar Inn, Mr. Tom Sims was quick to remark that no young man simply vanished into thin air. Over his morning pint, he offered his view with certainty. "Mark me, it'll be something criminal." He had dealings in London, as did Gerald, always rushing up on that early train, never saying much about his business. Too many secrets, if you ask me. The remark spread from the inn to the grocer's, and from the grocer's to the butcher's, each retelling dressed with new embellishments. At the post office, Miss Hartnell and Miss Weatherby argued over whether Gerald had been seen on the high street only the previous Tuesday. Miss Hartnell was adamant she had caught sight of him buying stamps, though Miss Weatherby insisted it was Mr. Ellison, who bore a passing resemblance if viewed from behind. Their disagreement, conducted at rising volume, provided the morning's entertainment for several customers, though it yielded little in the way of fact. Meanwhile, the constable, having found no trace of Gerald in the pavilion or its surroundings, had reported the matter up the chain. By breakfast time, Inspector Craddock had arrived from the county town, a tall, thoughtful man with a steady manner that reassured even the most fretful villagers. He established himself in the vicarage study, where he began his inquiries with a quiet persistence. Villagers filed in one by one to give their statements. Some relished the importance of their testimony, while others appeared more reluctant, but all had something to say, however trivial. Miss Marple, in her modest cottage, observed the comings and goings with interest. She herself was in no hurry to speak with the inspector, for she knew that those who rushed forward often revealed more about themselves than about the matter at hand. Instead, she sat by her window with her embroidery, nodding to passing villagers who paused to recount the latest speculation. A single thread, she reflected, could sometimes unravel an entire garment, and in the same way, a stray remark might expose the truth hidden beneath layers of gossip. Late in the morning, Inspector Craddock himself called upon her, perhaps out of courtesy, perhaps because he knew her reputation for an unassuming but remarkably accurate understanding of human behavior. "Miss Marple," he said politely after she had offered him tea, "I do not imagine you saw anything unusual yesterday afternoon. The crowd at the cricket match was large, but perhaps your sharp eyes noticed something." He spoke gently, yet there was a trace of earnestness in his tone. Miss Marple smiled mildly and folded her hands in her lap. "I dare say, Inspector, one notices little things without meaning to. People do behave so very consistently, you know. Mr. Linton's jacket was folded neatly, almost fussily, and I thought at the time it spoke of his character. He was a young man of order, not one to abandon things in a rush. So it seems curious that he should leave so suddenly without even his jacket." Quite curious indeed. The inspector considered this with a thoughtful nod. "You believe, then, that he did not leave voluntarily?" he asked. Miss Marple only tilted her head. "I believe, Inspector, that young men do not often act out of keeping with their nature, without some compelling reason. Whatever that reason may be, I could not possibly say." Her tone was modest, almost apologetic, as though she were merely sharing a trivial observation. But the inspector regarded her with quiet respect. By midday, it was known that Gerald's bicycle had been found leaning against the back of the pavilion, precisely where he had left it before the match. His bicycle pump and gloves were still in the basket. This discovery deepened the puzzle. If he had left of his own accord, he had not gone far, nor with any preparation. A man vanishing on foot without his jacket, bicycle, or even his cap, suggested not flight but some other, darker explanation. In the afternoon, the inspector called upon several of Gerald's acquaintances. At the solicitor's office in Much Benham, His partner, Mr. Yates, expressed genuine bewilderment. Gerald was steady, dependable, and not at all the sort to vanish, he insisted. Why, he had important cases pending. He would never abandon them. Yet when pressed, Yates admitted that Gerald had seemed preoccupied in recent weeks, distracted even, though he could not say why. Perhaps financial strain? The inspector suggested, but Yates shook his head firmly. No, his accounts were sound. At least so far as I know. Back in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Ridley repeated her conviction that a woman must be at the bottom of it. While Mrs. Bantry, though still loyal in her defense of Gerald's respectability, confessed to Miss Marple that she had once overheard him arguing with someone near the churchyard late in the evening. I could not make out the words, Jane, but the tone was sharp, almost threatening, she admitted, lowering her voice as though fearful of scandal. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she made no comment. Arguments in churchyards, she reflected, were rarely of a harmless nature. By twilight, the cricket green, so lively the day before, stood quiet and uneasy. A few villagers lingered, pointing to the pavilion as though it were now a monument to mystery. The inspector kept his men searching, combing the hedgerows and questioning anyone who might have seen a stranger passing through. Yet no answers were found, only more uncertainty. Gerald's absence was a hole in the fabric of the village, and with each hour it grew larger, threatening to unravel the calm familiarity of daily life. Miss Marple, walking home with her basket, considered what she had heard. Theories abounded: an elopement, a quarrel, a mysterious stranger. But she suspected the truth lay not in fanciful invention, but in the quiet, ordinary details that others overlooked. People she knew rarely changed their habits without cause. Gerald's neatness, his dependability, and his bicycle left behind, these were small things, but to Miss Marple they were significant. She did not yet know the answer, but she knew she was nearer to the heart of the matter than those still distracted by gossip. As she closed her garden gate, the evening air cool around her shoulders, Miss Marple murmured softly to herself, "It is always so with people. They believe the extraordinary when the ordinary is quite remarkable enough." She drew the curtains, lit her lamp, and settled with her knitting once more. The investigation was in its infancy, but she sensed that already the pieces of a darker picture were falling quietly into place. By the next morning, the matter of Gerald Linton's disappearance had ripened into something larger than idle speculation. It was no longer whispered gossip alone, but the official concern of the county police. Inspector Craddock had made clear his intention to pursue the case with vigor, and in his calm, deliberate manner, he began to look for someone upon whom suspicion might reasonably fall. For a community made uneasy by uncertainty, the idea of a suspect was comforting. Ed promised clarity where only shadows had been. The first to be discussed in this light was a man already known for his temper, Mr. Harold Sims, brother to the innkeeper and a player in the cricket match. He had argued loudly with Gerald during practice the week before, accusing him of favoritism in the team's selection. Several witnesses recalled the quarrel, though they differed on its severity. Mrs. Bantry remembered it as little more than a youthful squabble. Mrs. Price Ridley, with relish, described it as nearly a fistfight. As such tales circulated, Harold Sims found himself watched with curious eyes and subjected to muttered comments whenever he walked the high street. Inspector Craddock, keen to follow even the flimsiest lead, interviewed Harold directly. The young man, red-faced and awkward, insisted that he bore Gerald no ill will beyond sporting rivalry. "A fine player, Gerald," he admitted grudgingly, though high-handed at times. "But will it disappear?" "I've no part in that, sir, I swear it." His vehemence convinced some of his innocence, though others remarked that a guilty man often protested too much. The suspicion clung to him like dust, despite his protests. Next came talk of Gerald's work as a solicitor. Mr. Yates, his senior partner, had confided that Gerald had been troubled of late, and this hint of private worry took shape in the minds of villagers as a potential scandal. Some suggested that Gerald had been involved in financial improprieties. Others insisted he must have had enemies from his professional dealings, disgruntled clients, or dissatisfied adversaries in court. A solicitor, after all, dealt in disputes, and disputes often left behind hard feelings. If someone had reason to wish Gerald harm, it might be found not in St. Mary Mead, but in his cases. The inspector pursued this angle, visiting the offices again. He returned with more questions than answers. Gerald had indeed been handling the delicate matter of an inheritance dispute for a family in Much Benham, a matter involving considerable sums of money and no small amount of bitterness among the heirs. Though nothing connected the case directly to his disappearance, it was enough to fuel theories in the village. Some began to whisper of blackmail, others of revenge. In small communities, conjecture grows quickly when watered with fragments of truth. Yet it was not only men who attracted suspicion. Among the ladies, certain glances and suggestive silences pointed towards Miss Clara Godfrey, a young woman known to have admired Gerald rather more openly than was considered proper. Clara's flushes when questioned, her evasive answers and her nervous laughter only served to deepen curiosity. More than one villager remarked that unrequited affection could turn to anger, or that jealousy might drive even the most gentle-seeming woman to desperate acts. Clara, poor thing, found herself the subject of sidelong looks whenever she ventured out for her morning shopping. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, observed all this with a thoughtful expression. She listened to the whispers about Harold Sims, about inheritance disputes, and about Clara Godfrey's supposed infatuation. To her, they revealed less about guilt and more about the villagers' need for explanation. People, she reflected, cannot endure mystery for long. They will create their own answers if none are provided. And in creating answers, they often betrayed their own fears, envies, and small vanities. The inspector himself, though too practical to indulge in idle gossip, was not immune to the pressure of expectation. A suspect, he knew, must be considered, for otherwise his inquiries would seem aimless. Harold Sims remained foremost in his thoughts, for quarrels on cricket fields were tangible, easy to understand, and readily observed by others. He questioned Harold again, pressing him on his movements after the match. Harold swore he had gone straight home to help his brother at the inn. This alibi was supported by Tom Sims, though whether out of loyalty or truth was uncertain. Meanwhile, Miss Marple received an afternoon visitor in Mrs. Bantry, who sank into her armchair with visible agitation. "It is too dreadful, Jane," she declared, "to think of poor Gerald gone, vanished, and no one to say how or why. And all this talk of Harold Sims being guilty, I cannot believe it. He is hot-headed, yes, but not wicked." Miss Marple listened kindly, her needles clicking softly. After a pause, she said, "You are quite right, Dolly. Quarrels among young men are as common as daisies in summer. One must be cautious in drawing conclusions. People do act foolishly, but wickedness requires a different nature altogether." This quiet observation did not prevent the tide of suspicion from flowing. By evening, it seemed that half the village had decided Harold must be guilty, while the other half preferred to cast their eyes on Clara Godfrey. The inspector, however, remained cautious. His men had found no evidence, no trace of violence, no witness to an abduction, and no body. A disappearance without a body was a puzzle indeed, and until more facts presented themselves, suspicion was little more than a net thrown wide in shallow water. That night, lanterns glowed again across St. Mary Mead, and windows were fastened more tightly than usual. Mothers drew their children indoors early, and conversations by lamplight lingered long on theories of Gerald's fate. The cricket pavilion, once a place of laughter and sporting cheer, now stood empty and forbidding. Its locked doors and shadowed veranda became a silent reminder that safety, even in the most ordinary of places, could never be taken for granted. In her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and looked out at the night sky. The village might be eager to find a culprit, but she knew better than to hurry toward an answer. People were rarely what they seemed, and their secrets were often hidden beneath the most respectable surfaces. "It is always the same," she murmured softly, almost to herself. "We look where it is easiest, not where it is truest." With that, she drew the curtains and prepared for rest, though her mind, as ever, remained gently and quietly awake to the patterns of human behavior that might, in time, reveal the truth. The morning after Harold Sims had endured a day of whispered accusations, the air in St. Mary Mead carried a sharper edge. It was not the weather, which remained mild and clear, but rather the mood of the villagers. Suspicion had grown heavy, like a mist clinging to hedgerows, and though nothing new had been discovered, people spoke with a certainty that belied the lack of evidence. For most, the question was not whether Gerald Linton had met with foul play, but rather who had carried it out. Inspector Craddock, however, was less inclined towards such swift conclusions. He had spent the better part of the night reviewing statements and considering each piece of testimony. Too much depended on rumor, he felt, and too little on fact. Determined to see for himself, he returned to the pavilion early that morning with one of his men. They examined the small building again, methodically moving through its rooms, cupboards, and the narrow stair leading to the scorer's loft. Nothing had changed since the first search. Gerald's jacket was still folded neatly on the bench, his bat propped in the corner, the door at the back still bolted from within. It was as though the place itself resisted giving up its secret, yet it was there in that same quiet pavilion that a small discovery was made, one so slight that another might have overlooked it. Constable Barnes, who had a habit of fidgeting with objects as he examined them, pulled open a drawer in the scorer's desk. It appeared at first to contain only the usual jumble of pencils, ink bottles, and scraps of paper. But at the bottom lay a folded handkerchief of a fine linen far too elegant to belong to the club's ordinary players. More curious still, it bore a faint dark stain at one corner. Barnes held it up, puzzled, until the inspector took it from him. "Not Gerald's," Craddock muttered, studying the embroidered initials in one corner. "C.G. Clara Godfrey," he said aloud. He had been told the young woman was in the habit of marking her belongings, a matter of pride in her household. The discovery, though inconclusive, was troubling. Why should her handkerchief lie hidden in the scorer's desk, stained and forgotten? Craddock folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket, saying nothing further until he had left the pavilion. By midday the news had spread. Exactly no one could say how, but it had spread. Clara Godfrey's handkerchief in the pavilion was enough to set tongues wagging more furiously than ever. To some it confirmed her guilt outright. "Always too fond of Gerald, always hanging about," Mrs. Price Ridley declared, her eyes bright with vindication. Others, like Mrs. Bantry, protested her innocence with equal fervour. Why, Clara would never harm him. If anything, she was devoted. It makes no sense at all. Yet even she could not deny that the presence of the handkerchief raised uncomfortable questions. Miss Marple heard of it naturally, for the village was nothing if not efficient in its spread of information. She sat with her teacup in hand, listening as her neighbour, Mrs. Bartlett, recounted the news with breathless urgency. "And to think, Jane, that it was tucked right there in the desk. A lady's handkerchief! What business would it have in such a place? I declare it's proof enough for me." Miss Marple only nodded, her face as mild as cream. "Yes, very curious indeed," she murmured, her tone betraying neither judgment nor surprise. When Mrs. Bartlett had gone, Miss Marple considered the matter more carefully. Clara's handkerchief, bearing her initials, could not have been placed there by accident. That it bore a stain was interesting, though whether it was ink or something more sinister remained to be seen. Yet what struck Miss Marple most was the location. The scorer's desk was not a place one stumbled upon idly. To put an object there required intention. And intention, she whispered to herself, is often the most telling clue of all. Later that afternoon, Clara herself was questioned. She sat pale and trembling before Inspector Craddock, twisting her gloves in her lap. "Yes, it is mine," she admitted in a low voice. "But how it came to be there I cannot imagine. I must have dropped it, though I do not know how." The explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. The inspector, though stern, was not unkind. "Miss Godfrey, these things are important. If you recall any circumstance, however small, it may aid our inquiry." Clara could only shake her head, near to tears. To many her reaction was evidence of guilt. But to Miss Marple, who happened upon the young woman leaving the vicarage in distress, it spoke of something else. Clara's bewilderment seemed genuine, her fear not that of a culprit, but of a young woman caught in a net of suspicion she could not untangle. Miss Marple offered her a gentle word and a sympathetic pat on the hand, noting the grateful look in Clara's eyes. The old lady had seen such looks before on those who feared condemnation more than they feared exposure. The day closed with little resolution. The inspector had a clue in hand, but no certainty as to its meaning. The villagers had a new story to feed upon, but no nearer truth. And Miss Marple, sitting once more with her knitting, pondered the handkerchief and its implications. It was not, she felt, the solution to the puzzle, but rather a thread that, if pulled with patience, might unravel the larger fabric. People were often careless with objects, but very rarely with their secrets. In this case, the handkerchief might well point not to Clara's guilt, but to someone else's attempt to hide their own. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into a nervous rhythm. Every morning brought a new whisper, every evening a new suspicion. What had begun as a disappearance at a cricket match now seemed to have tugged loose the quiet veil of respectability that covered so many lives. It was not Gerald Linton alone who was under scrutiny. It was as though the mystery had loosened tongues and shaken memories long kept under lock and key. The talk of Clara Godfrey's handkerchief had grown stale in only a day, for it was not enough to satisfy a community hungry for revelations. Inspector Craddock had noted the object carefully, but Miss Marple, who knew the nature of villages, was not surprised to find the conversation drifting to other matters. She heard it first in the grocer's shop, where Mrs. Price Ridley, her voice lowered but her eyes sparkling, confided to Mrs. Clement that Gerald had once quarrelled with Mr. Peter Ellison over a boundary hedge. It was not just words, my dear, but shouting so loud one might have thought they would come to blows. It happened last year, and the ill feeling never quite went away. Mrs. Clement, half shocked, half thrilled, carried this morsel home as though it were an exotic treasure. At the inn that same evening, Harold Sims was cornered by two villagers who questioned him about his quarrel with Gerald at practice. Harold, already wearied by the muttering around him, snapped angrily that he had done nothing wrong and would not tolerate being treated like a criminal. His raised voice drew a crowd, and Inspector Craddock, who happened to be passing, stepped inside to quiet the disturbance. Harold's temper cooled quickly under the inspector's steady gaze, but the damage was done. More than one villager went home convinced that such anger could only come from a guilty conscience. Yet it was another matter entirely that caught Miss Marple's attention. A chance remark by Peggy Sims, spoken more to impress her companions than to inform, made her pause. "I saw Gerald near the vicarage late one night," Peggy said with an air of importance. "He was talking to someone, but I couldn't see who. He looked upset, as though they were quarrelling." Her friends gasped, and Peggy basked in the attention. Miss Marple, listening nearby, thought quietly to herself. This was the second time a late-night argument of Gerald's had been mentioned, and by two different people. Such patterns, she knew, were rarely coincidental. The inspector soon turned his questions toward Gerald's personal affairs. At the solicitor's office in Much Benham, his partner, Mr. Yates, admitted reluctantly that Gerald had been handling not only the inheritance dispute, but also certain sensitive documents concerning a wealthy widow in the district, Mrs. Fenwick. He was discreet, of course, Yates explained, but I gathered that the lady's family was none too pleased with the provisions of her late husband's will. Gerald seemed troubled, as though he carried a burden. The inspector noted this carefully, though Yates offered little more. When Mrs. Fenwick herself was approached, she bristled at the intrusion. "Gerald was a competent young man," she said curtly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "He did his duty and kept matters confidential, as was proper. If there were disputes among my husband's relatives, that is no concern of yours." Yet her defensiveness and the way her hands twisted the edge of her shawl told a story that words did not. Inspector Craddock left her house with more questions than answers. Back in St. Mary Mead, the villagers had begun to turn their attention to Clara once more, though for different reasons. Some remembered that she had once been courted briefly by another young man in the village, a carpenter named Lewis. "Jealousy, you see," murmured Mrs. Bartlett knowingly. She must have wanted Gerald so badly that she could not bear to see him with another. It was flimsy reasoning, yet in the fertile ground of gossip even flimsy reasoning took root. Clara, a poor girl, was cornered outside the post office by a small group of women who pressed her with pointed remarks. She broke down in tears, denying everything, before hurrying away. Miss Marple, who had witnessed the encounter from across the street, shook her head gently. Tears, she knew, could spring from many causes: fear, shame, even injustice. That evening, Inspector Craddock convened a small gathering in the vicarage hall, where several villagers were asked to provide further details of their movements on the day of Gerald's disappearance. The atmosphere grew tense, for to speak in such a setting was to expose oneself to the judgment of neighbours as much as to the scrutiny of the law. Harold Sims bristled under the questioning, his responses clipped and resentful. Clara Godfrey, pale and trembling, spoke so softly that the inspector had to prompt her more than once. "Mr. Ellison, When asked about the boundary quarrel, laughed it off as ancient history, though the stiffness in his manner betrayed lingering resentment. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, observed the proceedings with her usual gentle expression. She noticed the way Harold avoided the inspector's eye, the way Clara twisted her gloves until the seams threatened to tear, and the way Ellison smoothed his hair whenever the conversation veered too near his quarrel with Gerald. Small habits, small gestures, but to Miss Marple they were as telling as written words. People revealed themselves most clearly when they thought no one was watching. As the meeting drew to a close, the inspector addressed the villagers gravely. "Until Mr. Linton is found, we must continue to search and to question. I urge you all to be patient and cooperative. The truth will come, though it may take time." His words were steady, but the unease in the hall remained. When the villagers dispersed, they did so in low, hurried conversations, each carrying away their own interpretation of what had transpired. That night, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. She thought of the handkerchief, of the late-night quarrels, of the defensiveness of Mrs. Fenwick and the bitterness of Mr. Ellison. Each detail, she felt, was a piece of a larger puzzle, though the picture remained incomplete. It is always so, she reflected softly. One thread leads to another, and soon the whole fabric is revealed, but one must be careful not to tug too soon, or the pattern may be lost. With that, she drew the curtains and prepared for bed, her mind as wakeful as ever, quietly attentive to the undercurrents of human nature that would, in time, betray the truth. The village awoke to another morning of restless speculation, yet the routine of daily life went on. The milk was delivered, the post arrived, and children were sent off to school. But beneath the calm there was a current of unease that no ordinary task could disguise. The mystery of Gerald Linton hung over St. Mary Mead like a dark cloud, and though Inspector Craddock's inquiries had revealed much about the tempers and quarrels of its residents, no explanation had yet surfaced to account for the missing solicitor. That was until the news broke late that morning, setting the village once more into an uproar. A groundsman, trimming the hedges by the lane leading to the cricket green, stumbled upon something half buried in the ditch. It was not Gerald himself, but rather his leather attaché case, scuffed and damp with dew. The case was quickly brought to the inspector, who examined it under the curious eyes of a gathered crowd. Inside, there were papers and legal documents of various kinds, neatly bound, as well as Gerald's fountain pen and spectacles. What struck the inspector most, however, was the absence of money. According to Mr. Yates, Gerald had collected several banknotes the day before to settle a client's transaction. Not a single note remained. The discovery changed the atmosphere at once. What had been a disappearance tinged with suspicion now began to take on the color of robbery. "There you are," declared Colonel Melchett with grim satisfaction. "A thief, plain and simple. He was attacked for his money and likely killed for it." His words, spoken loudly, were carried quickly through the village, and by afternoon many were convinced that Gerald had met a violent end at the hands of some unknown criminal. Mrs. Bantry, upon hearing of the attaché case, hurried to Miss Marple's cottage to deliver the news in person. "It is dreadful, Jane, quite dreadful. To think of poor Gerald set upon in broad daylight, and in our village too. And those papers, why, any number of people might have had an interest in them." She dabbed at her forehead with a lace handkerchief, her eyes wide with excitement and horror combined. Miss Marple, pouring tea with her usual calm, murmured, "Yes, Dolly. Money has always been a strong motive, perhaps the strongest of all. But it does not explain everything, does it?" Dolly paused halfway through her sip. "What do you mean?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Well, my dear, thieves rarely take the trouble to hide what they do not want. To leave the case in the hedge, with the documents and spectacles inside, is most odd. It is the sort of thing that suggests not haste, but a certain intention. One wonders what it was meant to imply." Mrs. Bantry blinked, uncertain, and after a moment changed the subject. But Miss Marple's eyes lingered thoughtfully on the teapot, as though the steam rising from it carried answers invisible to others. The inspector, meanwhile, had his hands full. The finding of the case meant a renewed flurry of questioning. Harold Sims was summoned again, for he had been seen near the green on the morning after the match. He protested furiously, swearing he had only been fetching supplies for the inn. Clara Godfrey was questioned too, her pale face growing even whiter when asked whether she had ever seen Gerald carrying that particular case. Often, she admitted softly. He took it with him nearly everywhere. I cannot believe it would be left in a ditch. Her distress once again was noted by the villagers, who muttered as she passed them in the street. More curious still was the statement of Peggy Sims, who told the inspector that she had seen a shadowy figure walking near the hedge after dusk on the evening of Gerald's disappearance. "A man, sir," she said earnestly. "He moved quickly as though he did not wish to be seen." Her description was vague. Tall, wearing a hat, but it was enough to stir talk of strangers once again. The mysterious outsider, so quickly dismissed before, was resurrected in the minds of the villagers as the likeliest villain. Miss Marple, however, heard the tale with her usual quiet detachment. She thought of Peggy's tendency toward dramatics, of her fondness for being at the center of a story. "A man in a hat," she mused aloud when Mrs. Bartlett repeated the account later that day. "Well, my dear, that describes half the gentlemen in the county." Her words were delivered with a gentle laugh, but her mind was not laughing at all. People saw what they expected to see, she reflected, and what Peggy expected was something dark and mysterious. Whether that expectation bore any truth was another matter entirely. By evening, the village was once again divided. Some declared with certainty that Gerald had been robbed and murdered by a passing tramp or criminal. Others insisted that someone in St. Mary Mead itself must be to blame, for no outsider could have hidden themselves so well. The inspector remained cautious, unwilling to name suspects without evidence, but the pressure upon him was plain. Each day without resolution made the villagers more restless, more suspicious of one another. That night, as the last of the day's gossip faded into lamplight, Miss Marple sat in her parlour with her knitting resting idly in her lap. She thought not only of the attaché case, but also of the pattern of events since Gerald's disappearance. The handkerchief, the late-night quarrels, and the bitter disputes over money, all were threads that might yet be woven into a design. Yet what troubled her most was the simplicity of the robbery theory. It was too neat, too convenient, and above all too hasty. "People are so eager for explanations," she murmured softly, "that they do not stop to ask whether the explanation truly explains." Her eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained mild. There was, she felt, something else hidden in the shadows of the cricket pavilion, something that the village had not yet thought to question. And until it was brought to light, Gerald Linton's fate would remain a secret locked tight. The discovery of Gerald Linton's attaché case had not, as many expected, brought the mystery closer to resolution. Instead, it had deepened the confusion, fanning the embers of suspicion into a hotter flame. The villagers, eager for certainty, latched onto the notion of robbery, though no one could quite reconcile the oddity of the case being left half-buried, with valuables removed, yet documents and spectacles intact. Inspector Craddock, while outwardly steady, found himself pressed from every side. The public wanted an arrest. The press had begun sniffing about, and his own instinct told him that what appeared straightforward was anything but. Miss Marple, in her gentle way, sensed the inspector's unease. She had spoken little of her thoughts, preferring instead to listen, to watch, and to allow others to reveal themselves. But by now she had gathered enough threads to attempt something she rarely allowed herself, the setting of a deliberate test. It was not her manner to confront, at least not directly. She preferred the natural way in which people betrayed themselves when placed under the right conditions. And so one fine afternoon, she resolved to provide those conditions. Her opportunity came during a small gathering at the vicarage. The Reverend Clement, ever eager to preserve a sense of community in troubled times, invited a handful of villagers for tea, hoping to lift spirits. The inspector himself was present, seated somewhat awkwardly with his cup, and among the guests were Harold Sims, Clara Godfrey, and Mr. Peter Ellison. Mrs. Bantry, of course, could not resist attending, and Miss Marple herself arrived with her knitting bag, appearing as innocuous as ever. The conversation, as was inevitable, soon drifted to Gerald's disappearance. Colonel Melchett grumbled about robbery again, while Mrs. Price Ridley shook her head with an air of gloomy authority, insisting that Clara's handkerchief was evidence enough of foul play within their very midst. Clara flushed scarlet, her eyes fixed upon her teacup, Harold shifted in his chair, glaring at anyone who looked his way, while Ellison, stiff and uncomfortable, attempted to change the subject to the vicar's roses. Yet Miss Marple, in her quiet, seemingly harmless way, steered the talk back. "It is such a curious thing," she remarked mildly, her needles clicking. "How very tidy Gerald always was. I cannot help but think of his jacket, folded so carefully in the pavilion. Such neatness, one might almost call it fussy. And yet he leaves without it. People do not easily step outside their own habits unless pressed to it." She glanced up innocently, as though making no point at all, merely sharing a gentle musing. But her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, moved quietly across the faces around her. There was a momentary silence. Clara twisted her gloves so tightly that the seams threatened to split. Harold shifted again, his mouth set in a stubborn line. But it was Ellison who betrayed himself most plainly. He gave a small involuntary start, then quickly smoothed his expression, covering his reaction with a hasty sip of tea. To most in the room it was nothing. To Miss Marple it was everything. She said no more for a time, letting the talk flow on. The vicar spoke of church repairs, and Mrs. Bantry of her dahlias, while Mrs. Price Ridley delivered a lengthy account of her neighbour's chickens. Yet Miss Marple, content in her chair, knew she had planted her seed. When people believe they are unobserved, they often betray the very thing they most wish to hide. It was only a matter of waiting to see which shoots would break through the soil. After the gathering broke up, Miss Marple walked home with Mrs. Bantry, who was chattering excitedly about Harold's temper and Clara's pale face. "I declare, Jane, the poor girl is at her wits' end. And Harold, well, he blusters, doesn't he? But then there's Ellison, so stiff and cold. If you ask me, any one of them might have done it." Miss Marple listened, smiling faintly. "Human nature is very much the same everywhere, Dolly. Anger, fear, and pride show themselves in different guises, but they are always there if one knows how to look." That evening, Inspector Craddock called upon Miss Marple, more from instinct than from expectation. He found her by the window, her knitting in hand. After accepting a cup of tea, he sighed and admitted his frustration. "I cannot press charges on gossip, Miss Marple. A handkerchief, an attaché case, vague sightings in the dusk, none of it is enough. And yet my sense tells me the answer lies within the village, not without." Miss Marple gave him a sympathetic look. "Your sense is sound, Inspector, but you must remember facts can be hidden, but human nature cannot. A man may disguise his words, but his habits will betray him." She told him in her gentle way of her observation at the vicarage. Not accusing, not naming, merely remarking on the reactions she had seen. The inspector listened closely, his brows drawing together. "It is little enough," he said at last, "but it is something. And sometimes the smallest thing can open the door to the truth." He thanked her gravely before departing, leaving Miss Marple once again alone with her thoughts. As night fell, she sat by her fire, the flames flickering against her pale face. She thought of Gerald's neat jacket, of the handkerchief hidden in the scorer's desk, of the attaché case abandoned with care. And she thought of Ellison's involuntary start, that tiny flicker of unease at the mention of habits betrayed. It was not proof, not yet, but it was the crack in the veneer that she had been waiting for. Soon she felt the pattern would emerge in full, but for now she remained patient, her needles clicking steadily, as though the rhythm of her knitting might guide the rhythm of the truth itself. Inspector Craddock was not a man to leap to conclusions, yet he found himself thinking over Miss Marple's quiet observations again and again as he walked back to the vicarage. He could not dismiss the certainty in her eyes when she had spoken of habits, of how people seldom strayed from their nature. It was not evidence in the strict sense, but it carried a weight he had come to respect. And so, the following afternoon, he agreed to Miss Marple's suggestion that the villagers most closely tied to Gerald Linton's affairs should be gathered together in one room. If the truth were to emerge, it might do so under the strain of being observed. The vicarage parlour was chosen for the meeting. Its familiarity, lined with books and the scent of beeswax polish, gave the illusion of comfort, though the air within was heavy with expectation. One by one they arrived. Harold Sims, blustering and defensive, Clara Godfrey, pale and anxious, Mr. Peter Ellison, stiff as though carved from stone, and Mrs. Fenwick, veiled and resentful at being summoned. Mrs. Bantry and Colonel Melchett also attended, eager though unnecessary, while Inspector Craddock presided with grave authority. Miss Marple, small and mild in her chair near the window, appeared almost an afterthought, her knitting nestled in her lap. The inspector began formally, reviewing the facts of Gerald's disappearance during the cricket match, the locked pavilion, the discovery of his attaché case, and the presence of Clara's stained handkerchief. He invited each person to account for themselves once more. Harold Sims repeated his alibi with growing irritation, swearing he had been at the inn and nowhere near the pavilion after the match. Clara stammered her innocence, denying knowledge of how her handkerchief came to be hidden. Mrs. Fenwick spoke curtly, insisting that Gerald's work for her had been confidential, but without consequence to his vanishing. Ellison, when pressed about his quarrel over the boundary hedge, dismissed it as a trivial matter long forgotten. Yet beneath the surface of these answers, unease simmered. The inspector noted it in the tapping of Harold's foot, in Clara's trembling hands, and in the way Mrs. Fenwick's eyes darted to the floor. And then there was Ellison, whose stiff composure never faltered, except for the brief flicker Miss Marple had seen the day before. That flicker was the reason she had asked for this gathering, and it was why she now lifted her head and spoke in her mild, apologetic voice. "If I may, Inspector," she said, as though seeking permission rather than giving a command. "There are certain little things that trouble me. Nothing of importance, I dare say, yet small matters can sometimes prove useful." All eyes turned to her. Some were skeptical, some amused, but no one interrupted. Gerald, you see, was a tidy young man, his jacket folded, his papers neat. He was not careless. And yet his attaché case was left in a ditch, its contents disturbed but not destroyed. Her thief would not have trouble hiding documents, only someone who feared what those documents might reveal. She paused, her needles clicking once, then resting. And then there is the handkerchief. Placed, not dropped, in the scorer's desk. An odd place for such a thing. Too deliberate to be a chance. It suggested to me an attempt to cast suspicion upon poor Clara as it happens. A very cruel thing if one thinks of it. Clara gave a strangled gasp, while Mrs. Bantry exclaimed in sympathy. Ellison shifted slightly, though his expression remained carefully neutral. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft, almost hesitant. What struck me most, however, was the jacket. Gerald would not leave it behind of his own accord. He was interrupted and removed against his will. And that means the person responsible was close at hand, familiar enough to lead him away without causing alarm. Her eyes rested, almost absent-mindedly, on Ellison. A neighbor, perhaps. Someone with whom he had quarreled before. Someone who knew that Gerald had papers that could be troublesome in certain matters of land and inheritance. She sighed gently as though reluctant to say more. And someone who, when reminded of Gerald's neat ways, betrayed himself by starting ever so slightly. A very small thing, yet small things do have a way of being true. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the vicarage clock. All eyes turned to Ellison, who sat rigid, his face paling. For a moment he said nothing. Then, with a harsh laugh, he rose abruptly. "This is nonsense," he snapped. "Old women's tales and village gossip. You cannot condemn a man for twitching at his tea." His words were strong, but his voice lacked conviction. The inspector, watching him closely, spoke in a measured tone. "No one is condemning, Mr. Ellison, but perhaps you would be so good as to explain your movements more precisely." Ellison faltered. The stiff composure that had shielded him cracked. He muttered something about walking by the hedge, about finding the attaché case, but being too fearful to report it. The room stirred with shock. Harold barked in disbelief. Clara wept quietly, and Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's hand. Ellison, cornered by his own admission, could not retrieve the mask. His quarrels with Gerald, his resentment over land, and his knowledge of the solicitor's papers all now cast him in a shadow from which he could not escape. Miss Marple did not gloat, nor did she press the matter further. She simply sat, her face calm, her knitting once again resumed. "It is always the way," she said softly, almost to herself. "People think to hide their deeds, but it is their own nature that betrays them in the end." Inspector Craddock rose, signaling to his men. Ellison was taken away, protesting faintly but without real resistance. The meeting broke up in subdued voices, the villagers shaken by the revelation. They filed out into the twilight, speaking in hushed tones of Gerald's fate and of Ellison's guilt. Miss Marple, walking home with Mrs. Bantry, listened kindly as her friend poured out her shock and horror. "I cannot believe it, Jane. Ellison, of all people. So proper, so respectable. And yet, well, I suppose one never truly knows." Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "One knows, Dolly, if one watches closely. People show themselves in the smallest of ways." And with that, the quiet figure of Miss Marple disappeared into the gathering dusk, her presence as unassuming as ever, though the truth she had revealed would echo through St. Mary Mead for many days to come. The morning after Mr. Ellison's arrest, St. Mary Mead awoke with a mixture of relief and disquiet. The news had travelled swiftly, as news always does in a village, and though many expressed satisfaction that the mystery had been resolved, there was an undeniable unease in the air. Ellison had been a neighbour, a man of standing and apparent respectability. That such a person could be accused of a dreadful crime struck deeply into the hearts of those who had once nodded to him across their gardens or sat beside him in church. It was unsettling to realize how thin the line was between the familiar and the unfathomable. At the Blue Boar Inn, Tom Sims poured pints with a solemnity unusual for him. "Never thought it'd be Ellison," he remarked to the early patrons. A quiet man kept to himself, but decent enough, or so we thought. "Goes to show you can't measure honesty by the cut of a man's hedge." The villagers laughed uneasily at the jest, though the sound carried more nervousness than mirth. No one could forget that Gerald's fate had grown out of something as ordinary as a quarrel over land. Clara Godfrey, for her part, was spared the burden of suspicion at last. Yet her relief was tinged with sorrow. She remained pale and subdued, her handkerchief clutched tightly as though it were a talisman against further misfortune. Some whispered that she had been deeply in love with Gerald, others that she had been spared a worse fate by his disappearance. Clara herself said little, though Miss Marple, observing her from a distance, thought that grief and shame often walked hand in hand for the innocent as well as the guilty. Harold Sims, freed from suspicion, carried himself with renewed bluster. "Didn't I say I'd have nothing to do with it?" he declared to anyone who would listen. Yet beneath his swagger lay the bruised pride of a young man who had been doubted by his neighbours. He spoke often and loudly, as though the volume might drown out the memory of whispers. Miss Marple watched him with mild sympathy. Youth, she thought, often confuses vindication with victory. Inspector Craddock remained in the village for several days more, gathering formal statements and ensuring that the matter was thoroughly recorded. He worked with quiet diligence, his respect for Miss Marple growing with each passing hour. One evening, as he prepared his final notes at the vicarage, he paused to speak with her once more. "You saw it when none of us did," he admitted, his voice heavy with both admiration and humility. "That little start of Ellison's is the sort of thing most would overlook. It was enough to unravel the whole." Miss Marple smiled gently. "One learns, Inspector. Human nature does not alter much from place to place. A man in London and a woman in a village are all alike in their ways, if you have seen enough of them." The vicar himself reflected on the matter in his Sunday sermon, speaking in general terms of truth and the danger of envy. The congregation listened with rapt attention, for though he did not name Ellison, the shadow of his guilt hung palpably in the church. More than one villager glanced uneasily at their neighbours, reminded that beneath every polite smile might lurk resentment or grievance unknown to the world. The lesson was sobering, and few left the churchyard without a shiver. Mrs. Bantry, ever quick to resume her cheerful habits, invited Miss Marple for tea the following week. Over seed cake and cucumber sandwiches, she confessed her lingering unease. "I cannot help it. Janet feels as though the village has changed. I look at my neighbours and wonder what secrets they might be hiding. It is most distressing." Miss Marple stirred her tea with a faint smile. "People always have secrets, Dolly. It is not the presence of them that matters, but the way they bear them. Most secrets are harmless. It is only when resentment and greed take hold that harm is done." Mrs. Bantry sighed but seemed comforted, though she soon turned the conversation to her dahlias, as though to reassure herself that ordinary life could still prevail. As for the cricket pavilion, it stood empty for several weeks, its cheerful clapboard exterior now carrying an air of melancholy. Children avoided it at dusk, whispering that Gerald's ghost still lingered inside. But in time, as the grass grew and the matches resumed, the sound of laughter and the crack of bat against ball returned. Villages, Miss Marple knew, had a way of healing themselves, even if the scars remained faintly visible beneath the surface. One evening, as she sat by her window with her knitting in hand, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought of Gerald, of his neat jacket, his tidy ways, and his life cut short by a neighbour's envy. She thought, too, of the villagers, shaken but already returning to their routines. And she thought of Ellison, a man undone not by some grand passion, but by the small corrosive nature of resentment over land. "It is nearly always so," she murmured softly. "The gravest deeds spring not from great evils, but from small grudges allowed to fester." She laid aside her knitting and gazed out at the village. Lights glowed warmly in the cottages, children's voices drifted faintly in the evening air, and the world of St. Mary Mead appeared once more tranquil. Yet beneath the tranquility lay the truth. She alone fully grasped that human nature, in all its frailties and passions, was as dangerous as it was familiar. It was this understanding that had guided her to the truth, and it was this understanding that gave her a curious peace. For Miss Marple, mysteries were never simply puzzles. They were reminders of the complex tapestry of life itself, and so with a small sigh she drew her curtains and prepared for rest. The cricket pavilion had given up its secret. The village would continue its quiet rhythms, and she, ever watchful, would remain ready. For in every village, in every drawing room and garden, human nature lay waiting, and with it the seeds of mystery yet to come. In the days following Ellison's removal to the county jail, the village of St. Mary Mead began its slow return to normality. The tension that had gripped the cricket green, the churchyard and the high street seemed to lift, though traces of it lingered in the cautious tones of conversation. Housewives once more exchanged recipes over their garden gates, children ran along the lanes chasing hoops, and the milkman resumed his whistling. Yet beneath this everyday calm ran a quiet current of reflection. For while the outward rhythms of life were restored, inwardly the villagers had been altered by the knowledge that one of their own, a man long thought respectable, had harboured such dark resentment. The cricket pavilion itself stood for a time as a silent witness. Its doors remained locked, its veranda bare. It was not until the next scheduled match that the club committee debated whether play ought to continue. Some argued for postponement, saying it would be unseemly to resume so soon after the tragedy. Others insisted that the game itself was innocent, and that to halt it would give Ellison's deed too much power. In the end, it was agreed that the match must go on. The sound of bats striking the ball once again echoed across the green, though the laughter was subdued, and every eye glanced at the pavilion with unease. Miss Marple, watching from her garden, noted these glances with her usual quiet insight. Human nature, she knew, could not resist both curiosity and caution. People longed to believe in safety, yet were compelled to remember danger. As she poured tea for Mrs. Bantry one afternoon, she remarked gently, "It is always interesting, Dolly, how quickly people return to habit. Even after the greatest shocks, one still prefers the comfort of routine, and yet the memory remains, hidden like a shadow." Mrs. Bantry, who had recovered much of her usual good humour, nodded vigorously. "Yes, Jane, but I do declare it will be many a month before I can sit at a cricket match without looking over my shoulder." Clara Godfrey, once the subject of cruel whispers, was treated with newfound kindness. Neighbours called upon her with small gifts of jam and cake, speaking gently as if to repair the wounds their suspicions had caused. Clara accepted their gestures with gratitude, though she remained subdued. Miss Marple, who visited her quietly, observed that her grief was less for Gerald himself than for the humiliation of having been unjustly accused. "It is very hard," Miss Marple told her kindly, "to be misunderstood. But time, my dear, has a way of softening the harshest judgments." Clara looked at her with tearful eyes, as though clinging to the reassurance. As for Harold Sims, his bluster had lessened. Though relieved to be cleared, he had come to realize how swiftly gossip could turn a neighbor into a villain. He worked more steadily at the inn, avoided quarrels, and spoke with uncharacteristic restraint. Miss Marple noticed this change and smiled inwardly. Youth learns quickly when it is forced to, she mused, though she wondered how long the lesson would last once comfort returned. Inspector Craddock, having completed his official duties, made a final call at Miss Marple's cottage before departing. He sat across from her, tea in hand, and regarded her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "You see things others cannot," he said, "not in evidence or in statements, but in the smallest details. It is remarkable, Miss Marple. I only hope you know how much you've aided the course of justice." She smiled modestly, her knitting needles moving with gentle rhythm. "It is nothing, Inspector. One notices things, that is all. People do not change greatly, you see. The circumstances may differ, but their behavior is always much the same. A quarrel over a hedge, a resentment over property. It is quite enough to grow into something darker if left unchecked." Craddock leaned back, considering this. "It makes one uneasy," he admitted, "to think that so much harm can grow from such small seeds." Miss Marple looked up at him with her clear blue eyes. "Yes, but that is the way of human nature. We like to believe wickedness is dramatic and extraordinary. In truth, it is most often born from ordinary envy, pride, and resentment. That is why it goes unnoticed until it is too late." Her tone was gentle, but it carried the quiet weight of truth. The inspector, hearing it, knew there was wisdom beyond measure in her words. When he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, reflecting on how quickly the village had settled into its accustomed peace. Children laughed again, the inn bustled, and the church bells rang on Sunday morning. Yet the pavilion would always hold a faint shadow, a reminder that even in the most tranquil of places, darkness could bloom from the simplest of causes. She thought of Gerald's folded jacket, of the misplaced handkerchief, of Ellison's startled glance. Each had been a thread, and together they had revealed the pattern. Here it was never the grand gestures that told the truth, but the little things, the overlooked details. That evening she sat by her window as twilight fell, the sky painted in soft hues of rose and gold. The air carried the faint scent of honeysuckle, and the quiet hum of village life drifted on the breeze. To the casual eye, nothing had changed, yet to Miss Marple everything had. She knew, as she always did, that beneath the surface of every village, indeed of every heart, lay a mixture of kindness and cruelty, honesty and deception. And it was her curious gift, or perhaps her burden, to see those truths when others could not. With a sigh, she folded her knitting, drew the curtains, and prepared for bed. The cricket pavilion mystery was at an end. The village would heal and life would continue. But human nature, she reflected, would never cease to provide puzzles for those who cared to observe. And she, quiet and watchful in her corner of St. Mary Mead, would always be among the observers.